All right, so this video has been a little bit more difficult to form than some of the other ones, not only because it's, in some sense, a more complicated argument that I'm going to be having to make, but also because I've tried to film it a couple of times, and one time the argument needed a little bit of fine-tuning, and the other time my camera just decided not to record. So if this comes across a bit too terse, maybe that's going to be good. Maybe it's going to be a little bit more solidified than prior times, but if it does feel like it's being pushed along a little faster, that's probably because I've done this a couple of times already. So this week we're examining God's intellect. By intellect, we mean something similar to what a human intellect is when we're talking about it in the divine intellect. And of course, this is going to bring up questions about what is truth. Now, that's not exactly what we're examining right now. We're going to do that in about 2 weeks. What is truth is an important question to ask, and certainly when we open up the Gospels, we find that Christ is truth. He is the truth. He is the way, the truth, and the life. And as he's going to say to Pontius Pilate, he is truth. To which Pontius Pilate is going to say, well, what is truth? But that being said, for now, we're going to contemplate God's intellect, or his knowledge. Now, when I have an act of knowledge, or an act of understanding, if you will, I'm thinking about something with a truth value to it, whether that be true or false. And hopefully that corresponds to reality, we might think of. If I say that there are 13 chairs in the room, and there are 13 chairs in the room, that means my act of understanding corresponds to something outside of it, which is true. Therefore, my act of understanding is true. This is good. This is going to be a little bit more convoluted in more contemporary epistemology, but for now, we can just leave it at this. When God experiences knowledge, this is a bit different. Simply because God is not using something other than himself to understand anything at all, right? He pre-exists everything. He is not using deductive or inductive logic. He's not using his experience to understand things. Instead, he is more or less, well, not even more or less, he just is the barometer for what is true. His acts of understanding are themselves the barometer for truth. So it's not so much just that I look at something and see that in reality, and then if it tracks onto reality, it is true. But it's really the case that if my act of understanding corresponds with God's act of understanding, that is what it means to be true. This is a beautiful fact because this means that what it means to be a thing is that it is understood by God to be that thing. That's the most fundamental concept that I could possibly give to you this year, is that what you are is not prior to God's understanding of you. God understands you, and in his understanding of you, you are what you are. And that's because God is that he is. That's a beautiful thing that you can contemplate not only from a more theological and philosophical perspective, as we're doing here, but it's really mystical perspective. I mean, honestly, if you want to have one topic that you just like lay on the floor and think about, and have as close to a mystical experience as I could possibly give you, is just to think about the fact that you are only what you are because God thinks of you as that way. That's beautiful. Here, though, we're wanting to ask, is that which God contemplates, or is God's active intellect, which is a simple act, is that other than who he is? Now, if you've been tracking along for all of the other arguments, we already have divine simplicity at play. God's essence is his existence. God's goodness is his essence. He is this one pure act, undividable, not composed of parts. This is excellent. So you could really easily extend this into understanding his knowledge of himself, or his intellect as it stands. If you do that, you don't really have to worry about this. You simply say that, God is what he is simply, and therefore, if God is an understanding thing, he must just be equal to his understanding as well, too. And that's more or less the argument that I'm going to make here, but I'm going to make it a little bit more precisely than I just articulated it. So if you understand that general flow of what I'm doing, you don't have to worry about this argument too much. But if you want to think about this a little bit more, this is a way to do so. So the argument that I have to make is 7 premises and 3 conclusions. So it's a compound argument. And I'm just going to walk you through it. It's included below in the notes of this video. I'd say this. First premise. If God's goodness and being are interconvertible, then an act of understanding is the perfection and the act of the one understanding, since the perfection of the thing is equal to its maximal existence. That might sound like word salad to you. You might be thinking, Dr. Warder, what in the world are you talking about? It's a lot simpler than it might sound. It basically says that if goodness and being are interconvertible, that was the whole thesis of last time. So if you don't know what that means, go to the last video. But if they are interconvertible, as we decided they were, then an act of understanding is the perfection and act of the one that's understanding. In other words, if you're an understanding thing, then you're a perfectly understanding thing when you're understanding. Now, this is, again, we talked in class about how the book is more real when it participates in bookness to a higher level. The knife is more real when it is sharp enough to cut. That's the interconvertibility of goodness and being. Similarly, here, we're going to recognize that perfection is actually related to its being able to do what it's meant to do. So if God is the type of understanding thing, then he is going to be perfect when he is understanding. It will be what I end up coming to in just a little while with this. That's the first premise. The second premise just simply affirms the interconvertibility thesis, that goodness and being are interconvertible. And therefore, the first conclusion says, therefore, it is the case that an act of understanding is the perfection and act of the one understanding. Okay, so there we go. That's just a modus ponens argument for that. Now we already have a conclusion. Let's move on to a different argument. The next premise would say, if something other than God is the perfection of his substance, then either he is caused by another or he is compound. So I give you two different options to say that if something other than God is his own perfection, then he must be caused by another or he must be composed of parts. One of those parts makes him perfect. But it's not the case that God is caused by another, which would be perfecting him in this sense. And it is also not the case that God is composed of parts. He is not compound, as we've already talked about in this class. Therefore, it's also not the case that something other than God is the perfection of his substance. Okay, but remember what our first conclusion was. Our conclusion was that the act of understanding is the perfection and act of the understander's substance. Right? As an understander, he is made perfect when he is understanding, but it's not the case that there's something other than God that is perfecting his substance. Therefore, this leads to the last bit of our argument, which says that if it is not the case that there is something other than God that is the perfection of his substance, and he understands, that is, and he is the type of thing that understands, he's an understander, then the act of understanding, which is the perfection of his knowledge, is equal to himself. And then finally, we begin to say that, okay, well, God does understand. He is the type of thing that understands. Therefore, God's act of understanding, i.e. his intellect, is equal to himself. And so now we've ended up with the conclusion that is more or less the briefer argument that I made earlier, which is that God is equal to his intellect. He's equal to his one act of knowledge, which includes everything that is not him, but that act of knowledge is also him looking at himself. Now, this is going to be extremely important when we move to Trinitarian theology, because what we're going to want to say is that the Father is begetting the Son is begotten, and the Holy Spirit is the love of the Father and the Son. In order to do that, we're going to need God reflecting on himself, and then we have a relationship between the reflector and the reflection, both of which are one substance with one another, but both of which can be really distinguished by the relation that they have. And then from here we can also have the relation between the thinker and the thought upon, or the begetter and the begotten. And this is ultimately what we're going to use to ground our language in the Trinity. This is really excellent. I'm really excited for this move, and I think this is where some of the payoff starts coming through for all the hard work you've already started to do. But that's down the line several weeks. That is after we've had our first test. And so continue to get ready for that. Continue to think about God as he is in himself. And if you have any questions on anything else with this, please do let me know. I know this was a bit more of a fire hose than normal, although it's not necessarily easy anytime we have some of these videos. They're very compact with a lot of information there. But continue to dwell on and contemplate these wonderful mysteries. Continue always to be thinking about where there are holes in the argument and whether or not those holes in the argument cause the whole thing to fall apart, or if they just cause us to need to strengthen it in a little bit of ways, in various different ways. I look forward to the conversations that this is going to keep going, and I will see you next time as we discuss God's will as it relates to his intellect.